John LeMay from Ocean Tech. He's going to talk to us today about cybersecurity and best practices for business.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I am John LeMay, as Danielle pointed out. I'm with Ocean Tech, located here in Toms River. But like everyone else, due to COVID, kind of working from home a lot and dealing with clients who are not necessarily very local. So I'm dealing with local clients as well as clients that are kind of all over the country right now. So I'm seeing a lot of different things, not just in the cybersecurity space, but in general IT strategy, IT alignment with the business. Trying to make sure that IT is providing a solid return, especially now in tough times. However, we're going to focus on cybersecurity today and really how to best protect your business, how to improve the security posture of your organization. Because every day in the news, we're seeing another threat. We were talking just before we started the meeting. It was a little over a week and a half ago. We had the most recent one. Microsoft with their Exchange server email product saw a huge exploit that exposed a lot of information. We're still probably months away from knowing what the complete impact of that is. But again, you don't have to wait very long for the next one to come up. We had a couple before that, a couple weeks ago. It's a matter of personal data or financial information being leaked, and not really knowing what the total exposure of that is. We just know that information went out. It was available. The likelihood is it's sitting on a database somewhere now and will possibly be used at some point in the future. So those are the types of concerns we have with cybersecurity in general. When we look at cybersecurity statistics for the small and mid-sized business specifically, a lot of folks in the small and mid-sized business think they're not a target. That's not the case. Recent research, this was all from, it was released in the summer of last year, so it was collected earlier in the spring and summer. So it was information from 2019 and the first part of the COVID lockdown when these surveys were completed and this information was collected. But we see, 43% of cyber attacks out there are targeting small businesses. Small businesses are a target for these types of attacks. And it's generally that's because we see small businesses do not have the large internal IT teams to keep a constant eye and do the monitoring that's needed to ensure systems are being kept up to date. Any type of unusual traffic is caught early on. The bad actors understand that, and that's why they're looking at small business, because the larger companies now have mature security organizations or security teams within their organizations, and they're better able to detect and respond quickly. Small business and mid-sized businesses generally aren't that mature in their security. So that makes them more of a target for these types of attacks. We see here that the majority of those breaches are coming from email. And what we're talking about there, we'll talk a little bit about the types of attacks in the next slide or two. But that's what we all see, right? We get an email that says, click here, or reset your password, or this is from your bank or financial institution, and it's really not. If you look at the emails, you can see that these are attempts at what we call phishing. They're looking for information. They're trying to find someone to click on a link that's going to install some piece of software on the computer, unbeknownst to the user, that's going to allow the bad actor access to not just that computer, but all of your computers that are on your network, potentially cloud services, passwords, data from your clients and customers. It takes a long time to detect these breaches, and it takes longer to actually control them. So these breaches may go undetected for more than 6 months, and it may take over a month after that to actually understand. We detected a breach. What is the impact of that breach? How many systems were impacted? What do we really need to do? Do we need to reinstall software? Do we need to rebuild computers? so that can take a significant amount of time. Businesses can see downtime on average of 2 weeks. That can be, especially when we're coming out of the COVID pandemic, another 2 weeks of downtime because of a security breach to your technology systems is going to be a huge impact. We want to avoid that as much as possible. Probably the most astonishing number, 2.65 million is what respondees said on average was what that cost, right? So all the respondees said, here's what we spent to recover from a breach, the average of that number. And I don't recall now how many attendees, how many respondees there were to this. The average cost of the breach, 2.65 million to the business. Very high cost. These are complicated to unravel once these occur. It's much less expensive up front to prevent them. Which again, like we were talking about earlier and before the call, that if you were on and heard me say, it's not a job that's ever done. We put things in place, but then we have to maintain and monitor them and keep them up to date all the time. It's an ongoing effort to make sure we keep organizations secure. So here's a slide I mentioned. There's various types of attacks, various types of threats out there that we're trying to protect against. I think ransomware has grown significantly, and this is where an attack, someone clicks on an email and it releases a piece of software into your organization that's going to encrypt all of your data. Someone's going to call you and say, if you want your data back, it's going to cost you this much money. And I think that's a large driver of the cost we saw previously on the previous slide, the 2.65 million. I think a lot of that is tied to the ransomware payouts to get data unlocked. Of course, if your organization is facing a ransomware attack, you pay the ransom, there's no guarantee they won't do it again. So many organizations choose not to and simply rebuild their environment from the ground up after that. Data breaches are like what I mentioned earlier with Microsoft, Exchange Server, all of the email addresses, email content, attachments, all leaked potentially. We talked about phishing attacks coming in through email. And then there's sort of the traditional ones, and they're at the bottom of the list for a reason. Those top three are the bigger ones right now. The older sort of legacy threats, spyware, malware, and viruses, they're still important to protect against, but they're not the biggest problems today. They're still there, they're still a problem, but a lot of the cost is in the top three types of threats. So if you look at various security packages for your endpoints, servers, and workstations, computers, laptops, mobile devices, you'll see that a lot of the traditional packages that were considered antivirus packages are now security suites. They cover more features. Some of them do a better job than others. So understanding what features each package offers and what your organization requires is important to do that analysis up front before selecting a proper endpoint protection package. The very basic, if you have computers that are running Microsoft Windows version 10, which everybody should be at now because all the other versions have been deprecated and are no longer supported. There is some built-in protections against all of these. They're rather basic. They probably do a good job for home, maybe not so much in an enterprise where there's a lot of personal identifiable information for customers and clients, financial information. See, those built-in packages are just not going to be quite adequate. There's several other vendors, Bitdefender, McAfee, but again, depending on, we can't come out and say this one's the best because it depends on the organization, what we're trying to protect, the types of endpoints that are used by the organization, the level of training the employees have, sometimes will play into the choice of package. And we'll talk about employee security training in a later slide here too. It's probably coming up the next one or two. Let's see what's where. So everything we've talked about so far, I've pointed out that we're talking about protecting the data. We're talking about protecting customer data, client data, financial data. as well as the business intellectual property. Your business is there, you've developed processes, you've developed some type of service or product. We want to protect all the data that's behind that, because if that's lost, that's a critical component of your business. Recreating that or getting that back can be very difficult. So, and here is what I mentioned before about security awareness training for employees. It's the #1 risk mitigation technique. By educating employees to look for things like phishing attempts and to recognize threats as they're coming in, whether they're coming in via email, via phone, or identifying a poorly designed business process that may need to be looked at and re-examined. Maybe it's a process that worked well 3 or 4 years ago. Maybe it's inadequate from a security perspective in today's environment. So reviewing those internal processes to make sure that they are enabling secure use of data on an ongoing basis. There are many ways of obtaining security awareness training for employees. There's a lot of companies out there that specialize in that. They deliver that either on premise, virtually, or through pre-recorded web-based training. Depending on the organization, any of those may be sufficient, depending on what you're trying to protect and the level of awareness of your employees to start with. Any of the security awareness training, and again, we'll go into that a little bit deeper, but that needs to be supported on an ongoing basis. It's not a one and done type. Deliver the training and you're done. It should be done on a regular basis, and it should be supported through whether it's internal emails to your employees saying, keep an eye on this, or if it's testing the employees by using some simulations of phishing attempts to see if they catch and recognize the threats. Another risk area is passwords. Obviously, passwords are a real problem for everyone. Protecting passwords is critically important. Making sure you have passwords that are strong, not easy to guess, not reused across systems. Those are important aspects. Multi-factor authentication has gained a lot of traction. We see it in online banking software on our mobile devices or websites. When you log in, it's not just an ID and a password. It's now they're going to do something. They're going to require a code. They're going to require possibly fingerprint access to access the application. Or they're going to send you a text message to say, is this really you, to a registered device. Many systems, I won't say most, many systems support multi-factor authentication. And if you're looking at business systems that need to be upgraded, or SaaS solutions, web-based solutions for business software, multi-factor authentication should be a requirement in anything you're doing today, just to make sure you have that extra level of protection, that if a password is exposed somewhere, you have another factor to rely on to help protect that and ensure that the person who's logging in is really the person who should be. This next point, use of personal devices to access business data. This became a big one during COVID because what we saw was a lot of people working from home. They weren't necessarily taking business laptops or computers home with them to work. They were working on maybe remote devices from home, and we just gave them access to the business applications, where they were websites, whether they were in the office, and use some type of remote access to get to those. Personal devices are generally going to have software on there it's unnecessary, so it increases the risk exposure. It's also a device that's not monitored from a business perspective to ensure that it's meeting security requirements. Make sure it has that endpoint protection on it. Make sure it's free of any kind of threats or malware. So introducing personal devices into the business environment remotely can open up your business to other vectors of attack and exposing data through places you may not have thought of previously. Likewise, with personal devices, home Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi, they usually lack proper network protection. Either they have simple passwords to guess to get onto the Wi-Fi, or in a shared environment, cafes, libraries, you don't know who's sitting next to you when you're using the Wi-Fi. So unless you're encrypted using a VPN or some other method to ensure your data is not flowing in an exposed manner, it's going to be simple for a bad actor to gain access to that, should they happen to be close by. And finally, just mentioning again, endpoint protection and monitoring of that endpoint protection, those security packages, making sure that not only just that they're installed, that they're updated, that they're configured properly, and that someone's actually looking at the logs, looking at what is actually happening on those on a daily basis to say, are there issues that we need to look at? IT organizations today that do this actually have alerting methods set up so that if something occurs in one of those logs, it pops up on a console, someone sees it and picks up the phone from the IT side, calls the business and says, hey, we may have a problem. Those are the types of services that are important in order to stay on top of these types of threats today. So I'll go into a little more detail on each of those bullets. I know I'm talking a lot. Hopefully I'm not talking too fast. Any questions or comments? Slides?
We do have some questions and comments, but we can address them towards the end if you want, John.
Yeah, if we want to hold them, and maybe I'll answer them as we go through the slides. Just want to kind of do a spot check and make sure pace and everyone's good.
Everyone's good. We are getting some questions and comments in the chat, and we can address them. We can address them when you're finished, if you'd like. A little Q&A at the end.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay, so moving right along. We talked a little more detail about each of the bullets on the previous slides. I mentioned security awareness training, critically important. First level, enable your employees to help protect your business. Leveraging the formal training that's provided by organizations who develop this content professionally. This is what they do. They review this stuff on a regular basis. They're constantly staying on top of best practices, and they can update their training accordingly. Providing that training on a frequent basis. I mentioned the use of simulations, especially from the phishing perspective. There's some very good packages that let you automatically see if your employees recognize it. If anyone clicks on it, it's collected, it's reported, and then the employer, the business owner can look at that and say, okay, we need some reinforcement training because some of our employees still are getting caught by these phishing attempts. And in the real world, the phishing attempts they're very advanced. They can be very difficult to catch sometimes. You really have to rely on keeping up with the techniques and the methods that the bad actors are using. Look at everything suspiciously to start with is generally the best approach. So the training and the simulations help support that for employees. And again, I've mentioned before, these threats are constantly evolving. Make sure the training content you're using is fresh. Make sure it's up to date. Make sure it's applicable to your organization and your business. Different business verticals are going to have different types of threats, and there is training available based on whether you're in healthcare, whether you're in financial, whether you're in a different type of service. Education has their own types of training that are different because the threats are slightly different in each of those different areas. Password management. This is the next one on our list. Because everything relies on passwords, how do we make sure that we use good passwords? How do we make sure that we're not reusing passwords on multiple systems? Don't use the same password. Make sure passwords are changed on a regular basis. Sharing passwords between users. These are all bad practices that we want to remove. The best way to do that is to have a documented password management policy that you can give to your employees that they can access and just review on a regular basis to remind them that passwords are important to protect. They're important to not share. They're important to keep fresh and not reuse. Don't keep using the same passwords, thing 3 or 4 passwords over and over. Many applications and systems have settings to enforce the rules that you put into your password policy. So if you develop a password policy that says we're not going to use n number of past passwords, we're going to require upper lowercase alphanumeric passwords, special characters. Many, if not all, software today has a set of features. If the software requires a password, it will let you configure the password policies to match what your written policy is. So you want to make sure you align those things. Have the written documentation what the password policy is, and make sure your systems are configured to enforce that. The third bullet is a big one, and I considered putting a whole slide or two in here on browser security. It's become very popular to have password storage in web browsers. This feature should be disabled. Beyond simply saying don't use this feature should be disabled in all your browsers. Putting passwords in browsers, quite honestly, specifically Chrome, is one of the worst from a security perspective. It's not the place where passwords should be stored, and placing them there can make them very easy to access for bad actors. Passwords should be stored in a vault, preferably a password vault, which is a piece of software that's installed on your computers. Vaults that are designed for business use will allow multiple users to access passwords from the vault based on their rights. So we give a user rights to these 5 applications. They can get the passwords for those applications, or they can store their own passwords in there for those applications. The idea is that we have some place where the passwords are stored, they're encrypted, they're protected, but users can still access them. And in many cases, these business password vaults will not expose the password to the user, but they will allow the user to access the system. So could talk for another hour on how all of that works, because I just said don't share passwords, but if we're using a vault, there's ways to do that securely. Those exist, and if you have enough passwords that you feel your business warrants having a vault like that, could certainly have a separate conversation about how to use those securely and as a best practice for your organization. So multi-factor authentication, also known as two-factor authentication. We usually use the term multi-factor because we can have more than 2. We could require 3 or 4 authentication methods, although simply having 2, possibly a third, depending on the critical level of the system, is adequate. We want to make sure that MFA is enabled across critical systems. VPNs, popular during the COVID pandemic. We're probably going to continue to see a lot of use of those. So making sure we have MFA, not just a login and ID, but preferably an authenticator application, not simply a PIN sent to a phone number. Mobile device phone numbers are very easy for bad actors to hijack, for lack of a better term. However, the authenticator apps, such as Microsoft Authenticators, such as Authy, some of the other ones, are less prone, or actually they're quite secure. They're not, they haven't been breached to this point. They haven't exposed any information. They've been probably the most secure method of providing that multi-factor that we've seen of all, and that counts even some facial recognition software. The authenticator applications have shown to do a better job consistently across multiple platforms. The idea is that user already knows their ID and password. We're going to provide that extra challenge to make sure that we know that that person is who they are. That person is who we think they are, I should say, and that person does have authorization to access the system. And again, just to reiterate, right, this should be on critical systems. It should be on not just VPNs. Any login outside of the office, if you're logging to cloud services, should have some type of MFA protection. Protect all of your applications too. Again, protecting data is paramount. That earlier slide, that's really what we're trying to do, is to make sure that your customer data, your business intelligence data, your core of your business and your customers' information that they trust you with is protected at all times. A little more on home and public Wi-Fi. At home, people tend to use weak passwords on their Wi-Fi, unless they're relying on the passwords that come with the access points. Sometimes I know Comcast delivers the routers and the passwords on a sticker on the side of them. And it's a complex password, but the password's also sitting on the side of it. So the idea there is it's secure because it's in your home. The presumption is no one's going to access it. However, if someone resets that password, they're likely to put a simpler one in that's easier for them to remember. That can make it easier for people to access those access points. And that's true in public Wi-Fi as well. Public Wi-Fi many times will share that same password across all of their customers. Anyone who comes in and wants to use a Wi-Fi, usually it's posted somewhere. We're seeing less of that. They're starting to move to different methods, but that's still out there. And that means that anyone who walks in can be on the same network as your computer. Doesn't matter. We don't really know who that person is. We're just sharing all the information traversing the same network. So we want to make sure that network, if the network isn't protected, we want to make sure that we're protecting the data that's flowing across that network. Besides the Wi-Fi passwords, also the network names, the name of the access point, what's the name of your Wi-Fi. The technical term for that is the SSID. If it's based on an address, a family name, it's providing too much information, and it lets people who are just driving by find, well, now I know who Joe's Wi-Fi network is because it's named after his family name, his last name. I know that that's his, and if I want to target Joe's network, it makes it much easier to do so, as opposed to if you look in your home, 7, 8 different Wi-Fi networks are probably available because it's all of your neighbors that have their access points. So again, we want to choose something there that doesn't identify who we are or where we are. Keeping Wi-Fi routers and other network devices up to date is important. There's other things on our networks today that provide possible areas of exposure: smart devices, smart TVs, smart speakers, cameras. All of these things that are plugged into our home networks are another source of data. They're another device that presents an opportunity for someone to exploit and gain access to everything on your network, not just that device, but everything else that's there as well. So we want to make sure we're keeping Wi-Fi routers, all those smart devices, as up to date as possible. Make sure they're protected with some of the same best practices we're discussing here as far as passwords and names. And quite honestly, if you're not using them, turn them off. That's the best way to ensure that they're not going to present an exposure risk. If they're not there, they reduce your risk. And finally, we're talking again about endpoint protection, those security packages that are installed on computer endpoints. Obviously, there's nothing there for smart devices, speakers, TVs, but we can actually, by having good endpoint protection that's going to encrypt our data, it's going to protect our data, it's going to alert us if there's some type of a breach. Having that there helps protect against other people and other devices that may be sharing the same network. We talked about personal device risks. I talked about a little bit of those with the Wi-Fi in that last slide. Personal devices don't offer the same level of detail when we're talking about enforcing security controls. So we need to be cautious about how we're deploying those, where they are relative to where we're doing business work. If we're working out of our homes, if there's a smart speaker nearby, if you're having a secure phone conversation, well, maybe it's not as secure if that smart speaker is always listening. Depending on the level of detail and the level of security risk, the information you're discussing may want to move away from those devices. And this isn't a matter of saying, never use these or saying avoid the technology, but rather just simply be aware that these devices present additional risks. They increase the potential attack surface of networks. And there are ways that bad actors can gain access to information that they shouldn't have. So you want to limit their availability in the business environment. If that business environment is in your house and those devices are there as well, be aware that they present a higher level of risk. They also don't provide the same level of monitoring or the ability to manage those devices for IT teams. So from an IT provider perspective, smart speakers are a problem in that we can't monitor them as easily to make sure that, are they protected? Are they up to date? Our management software that IT teams generally use can't access smart devices. We will see them on a network, but that may be all we can really do is look at them, and maybe we'll see something about what the device is, but nothing really about the software update levels of the devices. So having those in the environment, they're not as manageable as say a PC or a mobile device. So they increase risk a little bit in that way as well. And again, right, I just brought up the smart speakers, TVs. We've all heard about baby monitors for years. We've known that for decades those have been a risk that people driving by can hear those. Not so much anymore, but this is the same concept, right? These are just other devices that are in the home. Smart speakers, TVs, cameras, things like that increase that attack surface. So back to data protection, which is really what this is all about. At the end of the day, we're protecting the data so we protect the business, and we protect the business's clients, customers, and intellectual property. Protecting data is paramount. Putting in a layered security approach, making sure you're doing the monitoring of the endpoint protection, make sure the endpoint protection is there, make sure that it's up to date, making sure that the employees are continuously educated. We'll put it that way, right? So continuous security education for employees to remind them, to support, to keep them up to date of new threats as they evolve. Controlling access and data, I briefly glossed over the idea when we were talking about passwords, is that making sure that employees have access to only the tools they need to do their job, complete their job role. If you have 7 or 8 applications, maybe each job role in your organization requires access to 2 or 3 of those. They probably don't need access to all of those applications. Someone in an HR position may not need access to a financial system. Someone in the IT space may not need access to all of the HR and financial data. Making sure those job roles are simple, they're well-defined, and that we make sure that the employees have access to only what they need, so that should their credentials be exposed somehow, we limit what is potentially at risk, and we have that documented. We understand what that is. So when that happens, from a business continuation perspective, we have an idea of how to address that, and we can limit that cost of recovery from loss of credentials or exploiting of a specific system. Data encryption, we hear a lot about data encryption, usually on the bad side from ransomware, but you can encrypt your data, and you should encrypt data, especially specific sensitive data, financial data. If that's stored on a hard drive or it's stored in the cloud, it should be encrypted so that folks can't get in there without the proper credentials to look at that data. It should also be encrypted as it's moving between systems. We hear a lot of folks talk about using, in web browsers, don't use HTTP anymore, use HTTPS, and there's ways to enforce that. That S means secure. It means that the data is encrypted between the computer and the web server that it's talking to. So that, again, it helps. It's another layer. It's another piece of encrypting the data, helps ensure that it's protected all the time. Depending on the application, depending on whether it's a cloud or an on-premise application, defines how to consider encrypting data. Again, a longer conversation, and it differs based on vertical and what your requirements are. Could have a separate presentation just on data encryption and the various ways to do that. Again, bringing up the idea of endpoint protection, proven endpoint protection, making sure that it's adequate for your environment, making sure it serves your industry and the specific risks that you face. All clients, all servers, and beyond that, web applications, SaaS environments where the software is living in someone else's data center. It's important to make sure that endpoint protection is in place, updated and monitored again, just to reiterate that point, because we can't talk about endpoint protection enough. It's after user awareness training, endpoint protection is really that next piece, along with the password protection to make sure that your data is protected. So this is the slide that kind of brings all this together, right? So we have to do all these things, but then we need to maintain them, and we need to operationally make sure that these are part of day-to-day practices. It's not enough to do any of these things once. They need to be ongoing, actively monitored, made sure that their policies are being followed, make sure policies are updated as threats emerge and as requirements change. The specific ones in here, obviously patching is a big one. It's gotten much easier to keep systems patched these days. Obviously, there's a certain amount of testing that goes on or should go on when system is patched, especially for significant updates. So making sure that things continue to work post-patching is important. But making sure you are doing those patch cycles on a monthly basis is ideal. Making sure that all, especially critical systems, but really all systems, actively monitored. Those alerts that I mentioned that IT teams should be looking at, make sure that those are managed and addressed. You know, they're easy to see on consoles, and you know, IT teams have access to them. What can happen though in those monitoring systems, that it's very easy to get too many alerts and makes it very easy to miss the important ones. So tuning those systems is important, and that's something that we do on the IT side. We put a system in to monitor an environment. We tune those alerts over the first some period of time, depending on the size of the environment. And then we make sure that we're only getting the alerts that are critically important, and that we manage those. We address the problem so that they're not repeated over and over again. Keeping up with maintenance agreements and warranties on software and hardware, keeping those current is important, not just from the asset management perspective, but from a security perspective, because it allows you access to updates to software. In some cases, hardware, driver packages are provided by the hardware vendors. So making sure that your platform, the software and the hardware that you use, is still supported by all the various vendors that go into that, whether that's Dell or Microsoft or whoever's providing the hardware or software. All of those products have a lifespan, and they're only going to receive security updates for a certain amount of time. But we want to make sure that those things are in place. Having some type of a plan to replace older devices on a regular basis helps ensure that the environment is more secure, because the devices are supported by the vendor, and they're releasing updates on a regular basis for their devices and software. Ensuring all the policies and controls we already talked about today, making sure those are documented, that they're kept current, that they're updated on a regular basis, and that they're enforced. Make sure your software settings match what your written policies say. Your written policies say we have to have passwords that are this many characters and this complex. Make sure your software systems are configured the same way. And if your software systems can't be configured that way, consider whether you want to adjust the written policy, or do you want to talk to the software provider about finding a way to enhance their security settings to meet your policy. There's certainly no reason you can't approach a software vendor to say, we'd like better password security or better security overall, enable MFA in your product, something they should be doing anyway. So in summary, once again, protecting data is paramount, whether we're talking about intellectual property of your business, whether we're talking about customer or client data. That's really what we're talking about doing, protecting your businesses, protecting the data. Providing regular and up-to-date and applicable security awareness training for employees. Do that as part of the onboarding process, do that on a regular basis thereafter, on a monthly or quarterly basis, as well as the ongoing simulation of phishing attempts and other types of security breaches to measure the effectiveness of that training, help you get some metrics on how well that's going. Enforcing strong password policies, make sure you're using multi-factor or two-factor authentication on critical systems, preferably all systems, although it's not quite possible yet. But you can certainly do it on most these days. And then protecting against the things that you are not in control of, the things you can't manage, public Wi-Fi, personal devices, whether those protections are simply not allowing public devices on your network, whether you want to provide employees with a computer to take home to work from if they're working remotely, or if you want to provide them with other types of services that use cloud-based PCs instead of VPNs. VPNs have some security concerns that are a little out of scope that we could talk about today. There are some other ways to do this, cloud-based desktops, but they help protect against the things we've talked about today. And then ensure the proper maintenance and operations processes, make sure those are followed, make sure they're kept up to date, make sure they're measured for effectiveness, make sure that people are following what's already been documented from a protection, whether that's an internal IT staff, whether that's your employees working on business practices and policies, or whether it's an IT provider. Keep some measure of how well it's going, develop some KPIs and some metrics to help understand the effectiveness of your IT security and how that's impacting your business. So that is the end of the presentation. Danielle, I guess we have some questions, maybe some things I didn't hit on or we want to review.
There is a question about risks companies open themselves up to when their key staff use their own emails to correspond on company matters, like a company controller or CFO using their Gmail because it works better, or when a company solely uses Gmail instead of their own email platform.
Yeah, how do we tell the C-suite not to do that? First of all, good luck with that conversation. I've had it several times myself. Yeah, it's a huge gap because enterprise level email systems have significant protections in place. In light of Microsoft's recent issue with Exchange, that aside, those systems are better monitored, they are better protected, they are doing a better job of protecting the environment. I think one point you can make to C-suite folks is that from a trust perspective, if I get a business email and it's coming from a Gmail account, or I get a business email and it's coming from a private, or not a private, but rather another public email site, and that person's claiming to be someone of importance and wants to do business, I'm going to be suspicious of that initially. And quite honestly, so is some of the spam software out there. Some of the anti-spam software that's protecting email systems. It's going to flag that email as potentially phishing, just because it's not coming from the email account associated with that business. I think there's plenty of ways to get everyone access to their business email on a mobile device or somewhere else. But if they're using an external account, that is very problematic, and we want to discourage that as much as possible. The best way to do this is by a policy and by educating the individual, say, look, this isn't acceptable. And here's why: from a security perspective, from a policy perspective, we don't want to use externally. We have email. We're paying for this email. This is what you should be using. If we're in a situation where large enough, we're issuing mobile devices to employees, and including the C-levels are usually the first ones to get them. We're usually also installing security software on those mobile devices to protect the email, protect the device from having applications to prevent security risk on them. We have all of these layers of protection, protecting the enterprise email system or the company email system. There's no reason to use a Gmail account or a personal email account for trying to conduct business. It's just poor practice, and something that if you're in the position of having a discussion with the C-level, it's definitely someplace you want to stand your ground and say, this is something we really shouldn't be doing. The company's made such a huge investment in a significant protected email system for the company. That's what should be used.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers that.
Yes, I think it answered that. And then if you have a Mac, are you more protected from email attacks?
I would say if you have a Mac, you're not more protected anymore from any attack, email or otherwise. There's really no difference from an email perspective between Mac, PC, or some other platform, mobile device or otherwise. The types of malware we used to see distributed were things like executables that targeted Windows systems primarily because there was a lot more of them. I think the types of threats we see sent around in email now take people to a website that's going to try to run some type of web-based software that's going to possibly expose information from that computer. Don't assume that because you're running a Mac, it's more secure. There's a lot of talk in the recent, I would say 3 to 6 months, about more and more threats that are targeting Mac and Linux platforms. We used to think that those were just sort of security by obscurity. They were unusual, so they weren't targets. That's not the case anymore, and that's not a safe assumption anymore.
Okay. And then using a Google Drive, does that increase your risk?
It depends, right? Cloud storage in general needs to be protected differently than your on-prem. The nice part about cloud storage is that it's plentiful, it's inexpensive, and there's a lot of advanced technology you can take advantage of in cloud storage, whether that's Google, whether that's OneDrive from Microsoft, whether that's iCloud from Apple, or whether it's a third-party provider. If you're leveraging cloud storage, either at that personal level to store your documents or to store your business data, or you have applications running that way, we want to make sure that that's protected, because you are using a storage system that's shared by several other people, thousands potentially of other users across the entire system, probably hundreds within that same physical device in that provider's data center. So we want to make sure your data isn't exposed. We want to make sure it's well protected, password policies, MFA, possibly encryption, depending on what's there.
Okay. And then also, almost every entity wants a different type of password. Is there a program that will generate a password for all of them? I know, like at the chamber, we use 1Password and it will suggest a password for everything.
I actually use 1Password myself. I like that one. I've used that one myself for a long time, and that's exactly what it does, right? So those password managers, similar to the enterprise password vaults that we talked about for business, that let you share passwords between different organizations or different folks in an organization. The password managers like 1Password and like LastPass provide some of that same functionality, but on a more personal level. They will let you create logins, generate random passwords, store those. They have browser plugins that will then let you access the password manager application directly from within the browser session, so you can enter your ID and password without remembering it. It makes it very easy to have long, complex passwords and not have to memorize them or type them in on a regular basis. Yes, password managers across the board should be used on a personal level. This is more focused on the business side. And we talked about the password vaults for business. On the personal side, the same point would be to use some type of a password manager.
Okay. And then how would one know if someone was reading your packets during transmission? Can they read encrypted packets?
It depends. So if you're using a VPN, the traffic between your computer and the VPN server is encrypted. However, the traffic from that VPN, wherever else it's going, may not be encrypted. The short answer is you don't necessarily know if anyone's reading the network traffic. Assume someone's reading it somewhere. Those packets are being sent from your computer to dozens of systems every minute of every day, sometimes more than that. So the safe assumption is that yes, those packets are being read somewhere along the way. So we want to make sure that what we're sending is secure. Encrypted passwords, encrypted data, and that was the data in transit encryption that I was discussing, right? We want to make sure that those things are always protected. If we use things like a VPN, the problem with a VPN is we're sending all of our traffic to one place, that VPN server, and it's only encrypted between those 2 points. We don't really know what's happening at that VPN server and beyond that. So there are other ways, browser encryption, encryption at the application level, depending on what applications you're using. A lot of them are encrypting their data back and forth. Banking software on your mobile device, for example, if you're running a mobile VPN on your phone, a lot of times you have to turn it off because the banking software doesn't want to see traffic from those VPN servers. They want to see traffic from your device encrypted using their own application. So that's an example of how VPNs, they provide some security, but for example, financial institutions don't trust them. Financial institutions want to trust their own encryption. And it's because they want to prevent those packets from being looked at, captured somewhere and used to access your data by someone who shouldn't have access to it. So short answer is you really can't tell. There's no indicator that says, hey, someone's looking at my network traffic. We can look for devices that are on the network that may be doing that. We can look for unusual IP addresses. We can look for unusual behaviors. But those are large and complicated systems to try to do that. And they still don't always tell you if someone's looking at your traffic once it leaves your organization and is out on the public internet.
Okay. Does anyone have any additional questions? Well, that was super informative. Thank you so much, John, for joining us. We did record the presentation, so we're going to have that on our YouTube account, if that's okay with you, John.
Absolutely.
All right, great. And next month is going to be a Grow with Google seminar with Adam Binder. So join us for that. And Member Connect is tomorrow morning. So thank you so much. Great suggestions for everything. And we will be putting a lot into play. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks everyone who joined. And please feel free to reach out, follow up directly if you have any further questions, comments, or just want to talk about your own security for your organization. Be happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay, guys. Thanks, John.
Oh.